Good evening, everyone. We'll start in just a minute.
Yeah, that's the introduction to the introduction.
Well, great evening, and once again, happy Women's History Month, and welcome to the closing session of the Politics of Jesus series, facilitated by Dr. Aubrey Hendricks. As you already know, I am Dr. Karen Owens, Director of Strategic Research and Adjunct Faculty at Hood Theological Seminary. Last week, Dr. Hendricks covered 2 sessions, Exposed to Oppose Systemic Oppression from Matthew 20, and Jesus's Vision for a Just Political Economy, John 6. Tonight, Dr. Hendricks will lead an open discussion to address your comments and questions, so please feel free to type them in the chat. And myself and Mrs. Sandra Oliver will monitor the chat and will read the questions to Dr. Hendricks, if that's okay with you, Dr. Hendricks.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
All right, before we get started, I'd like to invite Hood Theological Seminary President, Dr. Virgil Lattimore, to give just a few remarks. Dr. Lattimore?
Good evening, Dr. Owens and colleagues that have been involved in this wonderful lecture series. Dr. Hendricks, for your, I would like to describe as both your piercing and prophetic and profound discussions. As I listened these last few weeks, 2 people, actually 3 people come to mind. One is Paul Robeson, who is a member of the AME Zion Church, Frederick Douglass, who is a member of the AME Zion Church, and of course, Dr. Howard Thurman was not a member of the AME Zion Church, but he was a member of the Friends Society, and who wrote the wonderful text, Jesus and the Disinherited, which you have both taken to a new level and allowed us to not only understand in an anatomy way of the politics of Jesus, but also challenged us to not simply put Jesus in a kind of stereotypical area, but to allow his actual words and work to be instructive to us as we attempt to change society to fulfill the kingdom of God. So I want to say on behalf of the Hood family and our friends, thank you, and we will be sending you a very tangible expression, but also along with that will be a cloth that that has the old logo of Hood Theological Seminary on it. It's a triangle, and I give these to speakers for 3 reasons. One, to encourage you to continue to sweat, to do the work, the hard work that you're known for. At times, this work can bring us to tears because of the tragic disparities that it raises, but also it's a cloth that can be something to remind you of your time with us. So God bless you, and we give thanks for you. Thank you, Dr. Owens.
Thank you, Dr. Lattimore, for the very kind words. I've heard very good things about you and your tenure there at Hood. I have a few colleagues who have worked there with you, and so I'm very honored. I'm very honored.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
All right.
Before we get started, just a reminder to please keep your devices muted throughout the session. And again, by the end of the week, we will send this final recording to your email addresses. And this evening, we're going to stop at 6:55 p.m. And I'm going to ask that you will please provide us with feedback on this series via a very brief survey. The link will be placed in the chat where you can open up the survey, and we thank you in advance for your willingness to complete it. This free course offering is presented via the Pathways for Tomorrow initiative of the Lilly Endowment Incorporated. And of course, I'd like to thank Mr. John Everett, Ms. Kelly Bryant, Mrs. Sandra Oliver, whose face you don't see, but who has been working every week in the background, handling all the details. And of course, Dr. Virgil Lattimore, thanking all of them for their valued assistance and support. So I'll now turn it over to Dr. Hendricks.
Thank you, Dr. Owens. Yes, if you would just let me apologize in advance if the lighting isn't good. I'm actually on my phone. I had a mishap with my laptop at the last minute. I'm traveling, so I hope that it's not a distraction to anyone. But let's hear what we have.
Okay.
Let me say as you get ready to pose the questions, that what I've tried to do is share the political dimension of Jesus' message, which is not to imply that there's not, there are not other dimensions, particularly a spiritual dimension, but I have tried to suggest that that the political and the spiritual are intertwined with Jesus, because when we read the gospel clearly, Jesus talks about how to live and what to do. He talks about ethics more than almost anything else. He says almost nothing about belief. So holistic spirituality is struggling to build a more loving and just world as a result of our relationship, and our inspiration from God comes from the love your God, your Lord your God, all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, the vertical, and love your neighbor as yourself, the horizontal. And where the two meet is holistic spirituality, as I understand it. And of course, we notice that we can't have a cross without both dimensions. So we'll go from there. Thank you.
Okay, there is a question in the chat. It says, we are all aware of the horrific attack on the Jewish people in Israel on October 7th, and also the heartbreaking situation the Palestinian people in Gaza are now facing. In the spirit of, quote, treating people and their needs as holy, end quote, and, quote, loving your neighbor as yourself, end quote, if Jesus were alive in the region today, how do you think he would use his politics to respond to each side of the conflict? And that's from Daphne Glass in California.
Wow, that's a real important. It's a really important question. I'm glad you posed it to give me to cause me to think about this. Cause me to think about it. Well, on the Israeli side, I have no doubt that as we read through the gospel, we see that Jesus was so concerned about oppression and about exploitation that he would, I believe that there's no question that he would have opposed Israelis' treatment of Palestinian people for the last 75 years, their dispossession. Some of it's extremely criminal, as I'm sure you know. I mean, they just go in and take people's homes, and I experienced some of that when I was there. I was almost killed by an Israeli soldier over nothing. They thought I was a Palestinian. So on the one hand, and so in terms of this, and so I think in general, Jesus would be a strict opponent of the Israeli settler regime. In terms of this current conflagration, we know how the terrible murders by Hamas would have been such a terrible source of pain for him, of course he would have decried that terribly. But I could not imagine, as we read through the politics of Jesus and trying to talk about loving your neighbor as yourself, and talk about his concept of justice, the basic biblical concept of justice. It's hard to imagine that, number one, he would not oppose Hamas right now. On the other hand, he would be up in arms with the terrible carnage, I believe. So I guess the way I really need to answer is not just what would Jesus do. What is his teaching tells us? Well, where there's oppression and killing of innocent people, and exploitation, and just the kind of horror we're seeing, that I mean, Jesus would be holding both sides responsible, but not the Palestinian people, Hamas. And yeah, so he would be decrying the government, the Israeli government, the Israeli regime, and there's 75 years of despicable treatment and dislocation of the Palestinian people. And he would be supporting the Palestinian people's right to have decent lives, but I can't imagine that he would not or would not call us to oppose, certainly oppose the carnage by Hamas, but then to oppose Hamas's very selfish strategy of holding fast when so many people are being killed. I hope that makes sense. If not, repose the question, and I'll try to do better. Dr. Omens?
All right. The next question says, this is from Dr. Sam Oliver. Dr. Martin Luther King stated, "The ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over that by good people." In your opinion, is this quote still valid in 2024? And if so, why?
Well, I don't think it's valid because, I mean, it's valid, but it's not, I mean, no, because the evil that we're facing in the world today is, this is my opinion, it far outpaces the apathy that is experienced. Now, we know that it could not be as the evil could not be as harmful as it is, and it could not have such a toehold as it does if there was not the kind of apathy that Dr. King describes. But to my mind, the evil is just outdoes the apathy. And we look at the Pandora's box that Donald Trump has opened. Normalized evil, normalized incivility, normalized murder, normalized racism, normalized name calling, and just hate mongering. And that has gone around the world. We're seeing dictators and hate mongers actually using Trump's words and phrases and strategy. And so I think that the hatred now is much worse than outweighs the apathy. Though, of course, the apathy, if though all the apathetic people stood up and fought back, yeah, it would make a difference. But when I see this evil, Brother Oliver, that's really what I see as the major contradiction today. That's just my opinion.
Right now, there aren't any other questions in the chat. I'd like to encourage you all to share your questions at this time.
I thought there were questions from preceding weeks.
I'm going back. looking at some of the previous questions.
But to this last question, okay, I gave my opinion, but as I look back through the prism of the gospel, we know Jesus would decry both, but Jesus, I think, was more concerned with those who are apathetic, who turned a blind eye to evil. I believe that's who he preached to more. So in terms of the gospel, politics of Jesus, Jesus would decry both, I believe, but yeah, he would really be trying to rouse the consciousness and the conscience says of those who allow evil to exist. Boy, you guys ask some hard questions, I'll tell you.
Here's another question, Dr. Hendricks. Do you think critical race theory is anti-biblical?
No, I don't think so, because what critical race theory, of course, it is a theory of how racism pervades the law and how the laws of the land have been used to support racism. And to this day, I mean, racism pervades laws that are on the books. So no, I don't think it. I think that actually it serves the biblical purpose of making people aware of the areas of evil and hatred, well, and oppression, because racism comes. I mean, it's based. Racism is an expression of hatred, as we know in this country, and so critical race theory exposes where it is. That is, if people would take the time to find out what critical race theory is. Critical race theory, of course, has nothing to do with making white people, making them feel guilty or anything like that, saying white people are bad. It is a legal theory that shows up in graduate schools and in law schools, and it serves its purpose there. It doesn't show up in grade schools, as we know, or high school even, or even in undergraduate college. I mean, maybe undergraduate program here and there, an advanced one, but no, it is in service to the notion of justice that pervades the biblical witness.
Okay, several questions. The first one, this is from Dr. Nozella Brown in Kansas. She says to forgive her that she's traveling, but in light of what we know, how should we now live? What practical steps can we take to avoid AOTH? AOATH?
Okay, she probably
That's probably a
like,
type. Mhm.
yeah, because she's traveling.
How
Maybe
should we live
apathy.
now?
No, apathy. Yes, thank you. Would you
Apathy.
repeat that, please?
That's probably apathy, what she's trying to say. In light of what we know, how should we now live? What practical steps can we take to avoid apathy? I'm pretty sure that's what she means.
Yeah. Well, you know, I'm a believer of going back to basics of the biblical witness and the gospel. If we do that, that tells us what to do and how we should care and how we should live. You know, I mean, if we even go back to the core of the gospel, love your neighbor as yourself. That tells us what to do. I believe that tells us how to live, what to do. Matthew 25:31-46. As you have not done to the least of these, you have not done to me. That parable tells us how we're supposed to care for people, how we're supposed to live. And I think just those two core passages of the gospel, if we really focus on them holistically, and how and their implications in every sphere of life, I think that would take care of all of that for us. This would be a very different world, and the church would have a very different emphasis. I believe it would be not its main concern would not be institutional maintenance or or praise with our lips. It would be more about getting out and making this a world that's more loving and more just and safe for, as they say, for babies and other small things.
In your chapter on liberalism and conservatism in the politics of Jesus, you wrote that empathy was at the heart of liberalism. Then what is at the heart of conservatism?
Well, historically, conservatism was a worthy approach to society and to politics. It was about trying to focus on what was good and tried and true in the past and conserving it. Now conservatism has really come to be about conserving. I mean, in recent decades, it's really become about conserving power in the hands of the upper class and white folks who perceive themselves as being part of the upper class. So it's based on power grab now. You know, conservatism is not about empathy. You know, the conservatives are about against everything that serves the common good and the common people. And so it's about political conservatism now is about conserving power and reclaiming power for those who historically have had power, which is not most of us. Although we have Negroes like Tim Scott who don't seem to get it. Well, I didn't mention Clarence Thomas, so it's okay to laugh.
Hello, Dr. Hendricks. Would you agree that the method of government is from the teaching of the desire of God with the understanding the fall of man? If so, do you agree that the law and action would come from the form of creation with the order of the Spirit speaking and then physically manifesting? 2 Corinthians 3 and 6.
Would you repeat that, please?
Okay. Hello. Okay. Would you agree that the method of government is from the teaching of the desire of God with the understanding the
Okay,
fall?
could you stop? Excuse me, just a minute. Just a minute. The method of government. And I interrupt you because this is more than one question. But I'm wondering the method of what government? The government that we have now, or government in general? I'll answer. I'll try to answer both of those, and then hear the rest of the question. No, there's no God-given there's no God-given mode of government that I'm aware of. Because when you think about it, even America, democracy, you know, it included slavery initially. It was class-based initially. Poor whites couldn't vote. You know, they didn't have a full say. Women didn't have a full say. So that's not ordained by God, though it's a democracy. No, so no, there's no government past or present. And today, oh my God, God isn't guiding anything here, because God is not a God of oppression and hatred. And that's what's happening in this government right now. What's the rest of the question, Dr. Owens?
So I'm going to read it again. Would you agree that the method of government is from the teaching of the desire of God with the understanding the fall of man? If so, do you agree that the law and action would come from the form of creation with the order of the Spirit speaking and then physically manifesting, as in 2 Corinthians 3 and 6 that says, who also hath made us able ministers of the New Testament, not of the letter, but of the Spirit, for the letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life?
No, I don't see anything about the Spirit in government. No, not not at all. And by the way, the fall of man, the fall of humanity, is not a biblical concept. That comes from essentially from Saint Augustine. That's an interpretation, a later interpretation. Personally, I don't subscribe to that, the fall of man at all. I mean, unless you're talking about Genesis, but even if you go back to Genesis, that has nothing to do with government. There is no perfect government. There's no God-guided government at all. The best we can do is to try to inculcate the ethics of the Bible, about loving neighbor and caring for neighbor, caring for the common good, to inculcate that in our governing structures, but not theological beliefs, because not everybody has the same theological belief, and if we bring theological beliefs, it becomes exclusionary and oppressive, which is what Christian nationalists are trying to do, and hope to do. And we've seen in the past when Christianity has been when the religious establishment has been a strong force government, that's when we've had some of the worst terroristic regimes we've ever seen, inquisitions and all that. So no, we should not try to bring religion into government. We should become familiar with the foundation of the faith, right? And again, that goes to this concept of justice, of social justice, caring for the common good, because if we look out for the common good, that and for the least of these, if the least of these are taken care of, then how about those who are doing better? Everyone will do well. So I think it's very dangerous to talk about bringing religion into government. We should not think about a theocracy at all, because that's what Christian nationalists hope to do. And if they do that, then those who don't believe as they believe are going to be in trouble. And if I start a government based on religion, somebody be in trouble, because there is someone I would disagree with, and I try to exclude. So that's my opinion in sort of a mouthful, but that's how I see it for sure.
Yeah, so attached to that is, and I guess you kind of answered it, but I'll read this question. How are Christians most against Christianity today? Is it basically by not adhering to the politics of Jesus?
Christians are what again?
How are Christians most against Christianity
Oh.
today? Is it
Okay,
basically
no.
by not adhering to the politics of Jesus?
They're not. Somebody please mute. Please mute. Thank you. How it's okay. I was distracted. Read it again, please. I'm sorry.
Okay. How are Christians most against Christianity today? Is it basically by not adhering to the politics of Jesus?
Well, it's opposed Christianity. It's anti-Christian. I mean, it's not Christian nationalists they're not about love. They're not about inclusion of everybody. They're about exclusion. Christian nationalists are against the social safety net. So it's not that they don't practice. It's not just they don't practice the politics of Jesus. Is that they're what they are teaching and doing is anti-Christian. I mean, Donald Trump. They support Donald Trump, this walking mass of evil and hatred, and that's anti-Christian. And that's something that, I'd like my colleagues to start saying. They're not just Christian nationalists, they are anti-Christians, or as First John would call it, little antichrists, because their practice stands against the core of the gospel.
Okay. In part 3 of the book, you talk about Ronald Reagan and how others talk about his faith. How can these type of politicians cloak themselves in justice, but yet condone injustice?
Well, that's anti-Christian. I mean, that's that, and it's cynical uh, and in many ways, one might say it's evil. You know, if you read that, you know that chapter, you know that Ronald Reagan started his presidential campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi. I mean, and then talked about states' rights, knowing that those three young men died terrible deaths, and part of that was about states' rights. So that's evil. And I lost the thread of the question. I think I got so upset thinking about Ronald Reagan. Give it to me again, please.
In part 3 of the book, you talk about Ronald Reagan and how
Mhm.
others talk about his faith. How can
Mhm.
these type of politicians
Oh,
cloak
right.
themselves in
Yeah.
injustice, but yet
Yeah.
conduct justice?
Yeah. It's because I think we can say that it's because they don't take the gospel seriously. They see it as a means to an end. It's a political litmus test now, to say you're Christian or to refer to the Bible. And to talk about Ronald Reagan, when Ronald Reagan he really pushed those trickle down economics, which was just a way of justifying giving money to the rich folk, and it never and the wealth never trickled down. And in what was my third book, The Universe Bends Toward Justice, I spent a good deal of time dealing with the economics and dealing with trickle down economics. It's not even it's trickle down. It's trickle down ideology that you should take care of the rich, and the rich are taken care of, that they'll take care of the poor people. That's not right. It's hateful. It's anti-biblical. It's not looking out for the least of these. But again, these people don't care, and that is what is so frustrating. I mean, there are books that talk about the faith of Donald Trump. I mean, excuse me, Ronald Reagan. Um, I think I'm sure I quote that in The Politics of Jesus. There's the faith of George Bush and all that. You don't talk about faith and these politicians' names in the same sentence, because nothing they are doing reflects biblical faith. Doesn't matter what the heck they say, it doesn't reflect biblical faith or caring for the least of these. And so how can they invoke people like Ronald Reagan? Because they don't give a damn. Because Ronald Reagan is a cover for them turning their back on the call of the gospel, but claiming that what they're saying is consistent with the gospel. We have to call these charlatans out at some point, and call their evil out for what it is. It's evil. And if I get a little worked up, because I mean I'm looking at it straight up, they're destroying the future of our children. If we don't stop them, uh, they will destroy the future of our children. Our children will not have access to the kinds of governmental help and support that we have. I mean, they're trying to, work forever to earn Social Security. They're trying to roll that back. Medicare, Medicaid. They don't care about the people. It's cynical and it's evil. And I think we have to start calling it that. The gospel demands that we call out evil for what it is.
All right, the next question is from Boris Henderson. He is asking, what would Jesus say and or do about the growing affordable housing and cost of living crisis?
Well, I think it's what he would do is uh, he would be concerned. He would speak out again for the least of these, right? Matthew 21, 25, 31 through 46, he talks about folk with no shelter. And he said, how did I'm paraphrasing, but how did I serve you, Lord? Well, when I was homeless, when I needed shelter, you gave me shelter. And Jesus would be concerned about that. And that's another indictment of these right wingers and these Christian nationalists. They don't give a damn about uh, about affordable housing and enough shelter uh, for folks. They fight funding for low income housing everywhere it happens. They fight it if it's going to be anywhere near the neighborhood. At some point, maybe I'll do a little bit of myself. Some point we need to list the various ways these people are specifically opposing the dictates of the gospel. And you raise a good one, Brother Henderson, about homelessness. That is a real indictment of them, that they are not concerned about homelessness. Not only not concerned, but they're trying to. They would want to cut funding for housing, low income housing, and shelters for homeless people.
The next question is from Deirdre McCullers, and she's asking, should Caucasians feel guilty for the privilege that they're still receiving in this country, mostly at the hands of our suffering?
Yeah, I don't know that they should feel guilty, but they should acknowledge it and stand against it. They should acknowledge it and acknowledge that it is unjust, and they have a responsibility. If they're people of goodwill, they have a responsibility to stand against injustice. Some years ago, it came to my attention that there was up in New England, a lot of textile mills, and there was a mill that the workforce was integrated, but they had some layoffs, and every day the men who had been laid off would go to a certain bar, and they had no job, so they would meet there, have a beer, and commiserate. And one day, a young white guy came to the bar, all chipper and happy. He said, "Man, I'm so glad they finally bringing us back." And the guys were sitting there who were black men. They said, "Bring us back? What do you mean?" He said, white guy said, "I just got a notice that they're rehiring us. They're hiring us back." And the black guy said, "Well, we never got a notice." And the young white guy said, you have much more seniority than me." And he said, "No, we never got it." So as I'm told, he went to the office, and he said, what's going on?" The other guy said that they weren't rehired. And he said that the boss said, "No, we take care of our own." And the white guy said, "But they have seniority. I mean, how do you hire me over them?" "Look, we take care of our own. If you don't like it, then you don't have to come back." The young man said, "But I need this job. I need it. But this is not fair. This is just not right." And he turned and walked out. And he said, "No, I'm not. I can't. This is not right. I can't come back until you bring those men back who have seniority." And this is just like in the Lord's Prayer. We said, we release the debts of those who are indebted to us, and essentially what it's saying that we are not going to be a party to this unjust debt system, or this unjust, if we bring it to the current moment, this unjust hiring moment. And so whites, what this young man modeled, is what whites should do. They should acknowledge their unjust privilege and refuse to accept it as much as practical for them. But they should at least acknowledge it. Even if they don't do anything about it, at least acknowledge the reality of it. And if they don't take steps to undo their unjust privilege, might at least open the eyes of other white people. But to the extent that they continue to deny it, then they are engaging in a great deal of injustice. They don't need to feel guilty, but they need to acknowledge their unjust privilege, which means that to the extent they don't, that they are complicit in an unjust system.
I have a comment about a quote from Dr. King, not a question, just a comment. This is coming from Chester Owens. It says, "The belief that God will do everything for man is as untenable as the belief that man can do everything for himself. It too is based on the lack of faith. We must learn to expect God to do everything while we do nothing is not faith, but superstition." And he is saying that this quote of Dr. King remains valid today.
Absolutely, absolutely. It remains valid, and it has all kinds of implications. One comes to mind, for instance, is um, the travesty of so much contemporary gospel music, which which pervades that very thing about just leave it to Jesus, just wait on the Lord. Which Jesus never said. You know, Jesus taught things to do, and so it is not consistent with the gospel for folk just to leave it to Jesus, or just to wait on the Lord. Now, some things we have to wait on the Lord, but that is after we've done all that we can do, and that's part of the problem with the church today. Churches don't realize that Jesus taught folk to be activists, to actively do things to change the world, and not just sit around and sit in church and have fun and call it church, or sit around moaning and groaning. No, Jesus didn't do that. He was out in the world, and after he was crucified, his disciples, who knew him better than anyone else, they went out into the world and they changed the world. Imagine if they had acted like folk today in the church. But nothing happened. They still be up in the upper room dancing and singing and laying on hands and acting like that's all they're supposed to do, and raising money and and driving gilded chariots and all that kind of stuff and golden sandals. We wouldn't have nothing going on, but they Jesus and his disciples modeled what the church is supposed to be. So thank you, Mr. Owens. That's very important. Thank you for the observation.
Can you speak a little more about how this historic understanding of Jesus should be used by organizers today to increase the conciseness of our, I don't know if that's supposed to be consciousness of our community, and move them into the action for political, social, and especially economic power?
Okay, would you read that again, please? Mm-hmm.
Can you speak a little more about how this historic understanding of Jesus should be used by organizers today to increase the, and I think they mean consciousness of our community, and move them into action for political, social, and especially economic power?
Yeah, how we can do, I think, well, I tried to demonstrate that in the book with those strategies. If I had to summarize, I'd summarize it by looking at the model of Jesus. He was always on the way, and he was single-minded in trying to raise the people's consciousness. He went out among the people, but he did like the Black Panthers did. When they started out, they had their breakfast feeding program. They took care of the people's needs first, and then they tried to raise their consciousness. And Jesus did much the same, but he never didn't demagogue it and just go out and preach and and tell the people what to do. He really responded to the people's needs, and in the midst of that, he looked to raise their consciousness. And last week when I talked about John 6, that's what Jesus did. He did when the people were hungry, whether it was a supernatural miracle with the feeding of the 5,000 and the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, or whether what Jesus demonstrated through his example and through his teachings, that it opened up people to be more sharing and loving with each other, and being concerned not just with themselves, but being concerned that everyone ate. So they pull out, maybe they pull out their own stash. Well, that's what we should be doing, looking to demonstrate demonstrate in our activism what we think our society is supposed to be like. And one thing to demonstrate is love, brotherhood, and sisterhood, being caring for the common good. Most of what the problem that we have are people that there's very little of the kind of world that we want that's being demonstrated. And when it happens, folk, really cleave to. That's what people came to Father Divine, for instance. I mean, Father Divine modeled what it was like to look at God as a God of gift instead of a God that we're indebted to, and we're supposed to be so afraid of. Daddy Grace. They fed people, and they gave to people, and of course people gave back, and there were excesses and all that. But they understood the very basis of reaching the people. And we have to do that. We have to model. We have to model what we want our society to be like, and what we want Christianity to be like. And that's not being modeled too many places, unfortunately. Cannot hear you.
In the section Orders in Class, you talk about class differences. If Jesus said the poor will always be with you, what is the distinction?
Well, to my reading, it's pretty clear that he wasn't making a categorical statement. It was an indictment of the disciples of Judas, I think, as I recall, talking about why you let this woman use this expensive nard on you when we could have sold it and given it to the poor. And Jesus was essentially saying, well, if you're so concerned about the poor, they've always been around. You could have done something. And essentially, as I understand, he was trying to demonstrate that the statement was disingenuous, that it wasn't about the poor. Because it was about the poor have been around forever. But the way that it has been misconstrued is that Jesus.
Dr. Hendricks, you're muted now.
Okay, I don't know how I got muted, but thank you. I don't think it's Jesus making the statement that there'll always be poor folks. Don't worry about it. But that's how the politicians are using this today. He wouldn't. I mean, and it doesn't really make sense, because elsewhere Jesus is concerned about the poor, and trying to change the society and the relationship and the religious understanding of responsibility to the poor. And so for him to say something like, well, the poor will always be with you, it's almost like a defeatist statement. The statement was instead an indictment of this whole notion. Well, why you let this woman do it? Let this woman do this. Why didn't you just sell it instead for the poor? It was an indictment of this criticism of Jesus that Jesus saw as not well based. That's my understanding, and that's the understanding of most biblical scholars that I've read.
Dr. Hendricks, you said that the spiritual and political teachings of Jesus are integral to one another. I don't think I would be the only person to share that the political interpretations of the different texts you discussed each week were my first time thinking of the text in that manner. Why is it that the political teachings are not being shared on Sunday mornings. And this is from Dr. Regina Dancy.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, there are a couple reasons. Read that again, please.
Why
If
is
you
it
would.
that the political teachings are not being shared on Sunday mornings?
Okay, yeah. Well, I think there are a lot of reasons. Well, not a lot, but there's several reasons. One is that most Christians don't know. I mean, I didn't till I, went to graduate school and delved in. Why is that? Well, it goes back to the 4th century with Emperor Constantine. Emperor Constantine declared himself the 13th apostle appointed by God, and meaning that, that he could tell everybody and nobody can question him. And and when he eventually made Christianity not the de facto official religion of the Roman Empire, and since that time, mainstream traditional church has always been aligned with the powers that be for the last 2,000 years, except for some notable exceptions. And so, and the mainstream church has been the caretaker of biblical interpretation. And so they've interpreted the Bible from their social location, which is above, which is not from the perspective of those who are oppressed and maligned below. Although that was Jesus' social location. So when we come to the current moment, that's still the case. The gospel is still, the radicality of the gospel is still not acknowledged by mainstream Christianity because it challenges the powers that be. And not only that, okay, so I finished my PhD in 1995, and I was in really the first wave of biblical scholars in the Biblical Academy, because they didn't open it up really until the 90s, and you didn't have many women either. So they were like caretakers of this oppressive reading of the Bible. Also, we have these narrow understandings what politics is. Politics, in the sense that we use it, it's about the distribution of goods and power and honor and those kinds of things. It's not about partisanship. So Jesus was very concerned about the distribution of goods and services and power. But the narrow definitions of politics seems to be anathema and opposite of Christianity. I grew up hearing folks say, I'm not political, I'm Christian. There was no one more political than Jesus, and then he died for his politics. So I think that's the reason why it's changing little by little, because more of us are being allowed into the biblical academy, and we're writing more, we're speaking more, and people starting to hear more of the more holistic message. But there's a long way to go, and so everybody who's comes in contact, including folks who we've shared on through this media vehicle, all of us have a responsibility to go back to our various churches and communities to share these questions and raise these questions and opinions. And I don't say this in a self-serving way, but I think the politics of Jesus is a helpful resource that can bring back to your churches, to your pastors, and some of whom just don't know any better. They're not. It's not taught that much in seminary. Now, some pastors don't want to know better. They want to do the way things are because it serves them. But there are some who if we bring it to their attention, and they're sincere, they'll have to say, wow, that's true. The gospel is much more political, and it tells me that I have to be out here. If I'm going to be a shepherd, I have to struggle against the forces that would harm my sheep, meaning that they not only have to be empathic pastors, but they have to be prophetic social activists also, which most pastors don't realize apparently that they need to be. Though that's what the gospel calls for, if we really read it, with clear eyes.
Dr. Hendricks, it is 6:55, and while there are still many questions in the chat, we're going to have to cut them off right now. Would you like to give just closing thoughts before we go into the survey and close out the series?
Well, I'd just like to say thank you for the invitation to do this, and thank you all for your attention. And like one of the questioners said, some of this I'm sure is new, but it takes sincerity to listen to someone who's saying something that might be very different than anything you ever heard, and you might not fully agree with. But I appreciate that everyone has taken the time and apparently taken it seriously. And as I said earlier, I think the gospel says when we hear something that resonates as truth, that we have a responsibility to share it, and in our churches and our Bible studies, with our pastors, yeah, and that'll make a difference. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Oh, excuse me. Somebody said, may I just say, somebody said it's 501c3 that stops them. Well, yeah, that's true. They can't preach politics from the pulpit. Well, actually, they can, because the wingers are doing it every Sunday. We see it, but but we would be the ones who would get in trouble. But what can be held up are basic principles. You can talk about the Bible calling for justice and working for the common good and all that, and that we should have policies that take care of the poor and all that. That's biblical. That's not a violation. And also, you can have social justice committees in the church, who can raise issues in meetings, and that wouldn't violate it either. I just will leave it with this: those who really want to make a difference will do it. They'll find a way to do it. And if they don't, it's because they haven't put forth the effort, or they don't know any better. And it's up to us to help to try to raise the consciousness as best we can. Thank you all so much.
All righty. So yes, Dr. Hendricks, thank you, thank you, thank you. We just can't thank you enough. And to all of you all, thank you for your attendance tonight. At this time, the survey is going to be put in the chat. If you will just click on the link and be so kind to fill out the survey. It should only take you just 2 or 3 minutes to do so. We'd appreciate that very much. And again, we thank you for your attendance. Many of you have been here through all 6 sessions, and so we're very grateful for that. So I'll stay on as you fill out the survey, and once you fill it out, please enjoy your evening and keep checking your inboxes for our next series that will start in the fall of this year. Good evening, everyone. You should be able to